Hi everyone, today we are doing the record collection. This is a challenge that's been brought up to me in a few separate locations actually, so I thought this would be a good one to do. It's a very important concept to learn as well. There's a good amount of logic to handle in this, and there's a more complex data structure that we have to kind of traverse through. So before we get started in the actual problem, I want to take a look a little more closely at traversing a complex data structure, such as an object with arrays in it and stuff like that. So at this point, we've all kind of done, a basic object, which I have right here, just one property, and it's a primitive, a string, that is the value. So of course, if we, make sure I run this, if we ask for basic, we get its object, and it shows us it's one key. And then if we do basic.foo, looking up the key within this object, we just get back the string bar, which is why I can do basic.foo and concatenate an s onto it, and we get back bars. And I couldn't do that, of course, with this because we are adding a string onto an object. We get the object stringified, and that's not usually what you want to, that's not usually the result you want. Okay, so now we have this larger thing here. We have, we have collection. If we ask for that, we get the same exact thing back. But just as before, we can get one of these numbers. Of course, when we do a number, we need to put in bracket notation. So if I do like 2548, we still get back an object, but it's just the object which 2548 points to. So now that we are inside here, we can also look something up again. We can look up artist, for example, or we can even look up tracks. I'm going to look up tracks so I can keep diving further into this data structure rabbit hole here. So to just press up to get the last thing back, I can do dot tracks, and now we get back the array. Over here, we go into the collection, we go into 2548, we go into tracks, and of course I can do that one more time. Since we have an array here, we can access one of the elements and we get that. So going through a large complex data structure is really just a process of going one level deeper each time and tracing where you are. Now of course there's one other thing to realize. If we do, if we make a variable and point it to something, we get that, we can use that variable to access a property, just like this. Alias points to foo, we get bar back. But we can't do something like this. Whenever we use dot notation, this is very important. Whenever we use dot notation, it takes a literal interpretation of this. So if we do that, we get undefined because there is no alias property. I could do something like this. Right? I could add that literal property, just run this. Now when I do basic.alias, I get the literal basic property back. We get the alias. But if we do basic of the variable alias, that's the big difference here. This variable still points to foo. I think I have to redefine it because I reran it. So let's do, right, that's what we had before. There we go. So if we do this, we still get back bar. Again, that gives us the alias, the variable, and this is the literal. Two entirely different things. Brackets will always analyze some text in there, and brackets are always needed for numbers, which is just always, which will always point to the same thing. All right, so now we look at the actual problem here. And as usual, we should take it step by step. We want to write a function in which the album's ID, a property, and a value is used to modify data in the collection. So we have these three parameters here. We know what each of them is going to kind of map to. Now the first task is, if the prop isn't tracks and the value isn't empty, update or set the value for that album's property. So let's make this if statement here. I'm going to bring this up a little bit so you can see it a little nicer. So we have our if statement, and the first part is pretty easy. If we want if prop isn't tracks, so if prop is not equal to tracks. And there's something else as well. Since there's an and, this is probably a logical and. It'll compare both sides, return true only if both are true, if the value isn't empty. So we could write if value is not equal to an empty string, or we could just do this. And that will return truthy or falsy. So if this value is an empty string, it will evaluate to false. And since we don't want it to be false, that will work here, because then I'll just skip the if statement. So now that we have that, we need to update the value for the record albums property. So we first need to find which ID we're talking about, right? We're going to be accessing something in this collection. So this ID here, if we look at our first example, they're going to pass in 5439. We can kind of track it in real time. So we have 5439. That's going to access this right here. So let's do ID, right? Collection of ID will access this. And then it's going to take artist and ABBA. Now there is no artist here. So what does it want us to do here? Let's kind of read around. We can read if isn't tracks, updated value of the record albums property. And is there anything it says? So it doesn't say anything. So in this case, until we get something else, we can just add the property on there. If the property before it exists, then we can just add it on with an equal operator and the property will appear. If the ID didn't exist, the next thing here would give us an error, because then it would not be able to read property of undefined. But this ID does exist. So we can create the very next level always. So we will do prop, and that will create the artist property. And we're going to set that equal to the value. And collection is already being returned there, so that will work fine. Let's try running this. So this first one is working. Let's look at the second test. After update records, 5439 tracks, take a chance on me. Track should have take a chance on me in the last element. Okay, so we are looking at another property that doesn't exist. So let's go back up here. We have another rule that will help us for this test. If prop is tracks, but the album doesn't have a tracks property, we need to create an empty array first. So since the prop is tracks, we can do an else statement here, because this always evaluates for things that isn't tracks, but now we are on to tracks. So now the prop doesn't have a tracks property, create an empty array. Okay, so what we want to do is we need to see if the object that we are accessing has its property, and we can use has own property. So we are looking for collection again of the ID of the prop, just like before. And we already know this prop is going to be tracks. So now, or we actually don't, sorry. We're just going to the ID, because then we're getting this object, and then we're seeing if that object has the property. So then we do has own property tracks. So this will return true if it does have tracks. But we want to check if it doesn't have tracks, so I'm going to negate this. Now it will return true if it doesn't have tracks. And if it doesn't, we're going to need to instantiate that this object here with that tracks within an empty array. So we can just put all in the same line. Collection of ID, same thing here, dot tracks, And just like before, how we kind of created that property one level deeper, we are creating this tracks property one level deeper. And we are adding an empty array there. And now comes the part that we would do whether the array was there or not. We push the new value into this array. So we can do collection of ID dot tracks, and that will give us this empty array here if it doesn't exist. Dot push, and we push the value onto it. Now what if this array did exist, like this one right here, 2468? If the array did exist, then this would return false, and we would just go to the next line where we push the value, and that will work since we already have an array. This if statement keeps us from wiping out the previous tracks if they exist. But if they don't, it will trigger and we'll be able to instantiate with an empty array. So let's try running this now. And we got a few more tests passing. We are on the right track. So we were just, where were we? We were at if prop tracks, doesn't tracks. We just did that. Now I have a few other things. If prop is tracks and value isn't empty, push the value onto the end of the album's existing tracks array. Right. So this also is the same idea here. If there's a value, and this part will help us refactor this a little bit. If the value is empty, delete the given property from the album. So this is where we can kind of change things a bit. Now that we have this put into play, this delete method, the function is basically acting in two different ways. It's doing one thing if there is a value, and another thing if there isn't. So at the very top, we're going to first check to see if there's a value. And if there isn't a value, this is where the delete functionality is going to go. So what does it say again? If the value is empty, delete the given property from the album. So again, that album is always going to come from the ID. So we're going to be accessing collection of ID, and we want to delete the prop on it. So we can just say delete, and when you use the delete key in a complex object like this, it's not going to delete the entire collection. It's going to delete the last thing that gets returned from here. So in the case of, if it was something like this, right? 2458 artists empty string. The ID is 2458, the prop is artists. It's going to look up on the collection 2458 or 2548 here, and then it's going to look up the tracks right here, and then it's going to delete this whole property, including the property tracks. Okay, so let's try running that. And then we got one more, of course. We have track should not be set after update records. So why does this happen right now? You think that it deleted tracks, and it did, but then what happens is that it's continuing down this chain, right? It's looking for, then it's going through here, props not equal to tracks, and then it goes into this else statement again. And then it's instantiating it with an empty array, and then it's probably pushing an empty string onto it as well. We can actually update this to see what's happening. 2548 tracks empty string. So let's run that, and yep, we can see right here tracks has that empty string. So it deletes it, but then it recreates it. So we just need to prevent that as well. And since this is the only thing that's happening here and we don't want anything else happening, we can add another return statement. We can just return the collection here, which is what I like to do. So that way, if there isn't a value, we just do this and return it, and we don't even get here. And then the rest of this is kind of an implicit else, because we are only going to get down here if this does not happen. This return will break out of the function immediately, as returns always do. One other thing is that since there is no value here, there is always going to be a value here, so we can actually refactor this a little bit and make it a little more cleaner. We just have to check for the props now that we're down here. If we run this one more time, we knew that we could do it. All right. So that is record collection. This is a very important concept to understand. It's not enough just to kind of recognize the pattern and see if you can fudge and copy it. You need to be very comfortable with modifying and changing complex data structures, because they only get more complicated from here. So definitely ask some questions in the comments if something is still unclear. This is definitely essential. Thanks for watching, everyone.